But please note that we'll be addressing all the questions at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session. So today's webinar on stand dynamics is the first in a series about silviculture management for New Brunswick private woodlot owners in relation to climate change adaptation. This webinar series is part of a project called Building Capacity of New Brunswick Woodlot Owners to Adapt to Climate Change, which you can learn more about on the Federation's webpage, nbwoodlotowners.ca, or you can follow us on Facebook as well. This project is supported by funding from the Natural Resource Canada's Climate Change Adaptation Program and GMB's Environmental Trust Fund, as well as through the work by our project partners, Community Forests International, UNB, and the New Brunswick Department of Natural Resources and Energy Development. We especially want to thank the New Brunswick Environmental Network for assisting us with today's webinar connectivity. One of the project's main goals was to create a new tool for aiding woodlot owners and silviculture professionals in creating management plans for woodlots that include climate change adaptation options. You can download a copy of the Climate Adaptive Silviculture Prescription Tool and the companion document that goes along with it on our project webpage, or you can feel free to contact me and I'll email you a copy. Today's presenter, Gareth Davies, created the initial version of this tool, and his presentation today is designed to ensure users all have a uniform starting point of understanding of the terminology used within it. In future webinars, we'll be discussing such topics as emerging forest issues, pests and diseases, and extreme weather events, and how they relate to the future of New Brunswick's forests. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Gareth Davies. He's a forest ecologist, silviculturalist, and instructor at the Maritime College of Forest Technology. Gareth?
Hello, can everybody hear me? I hope.
can hear you now.
Wonderful. Everybody bear with me. This is a bit of a new experience for me. I'm a full-time instructor at the Maritime College of Forest Technology, and students recognize quickly that the longer I speak, the more uncomfortable I often get. So I tend to be driven by giving students things to do and engaging with them directly. So this is, giving a webinar is very much a new experience for me. So what the format of this is a presentation where I will lead us through a series of slides, and I do have a couple of exercises that I'm going to ask you to work on as we're going through it, and we will review those exercises if necessary at the end of the presentation, as opposed to pausing and engaging directly with those exercises in the process. So stand dynamics, I'm going to move on to the next slide here. I'm used to a different thing here. So stand dynamics. Stand dynamics is a branch of forest ecology that deals specifically with studying and projecting how forest stands change in composition. In other words, succession, and structure. In other words, development. The practice of silviculture is specific to the manipulation of the vegetation and site that forest stands grow in, and the concept of a stand being central to the application of silviculture, such that we at an operational level, when we're manipulating vegetation, we work at the stand level, and what differentiates one stand from another is entirely dependent upon both the ecological condition of a forest and the character of the site that forest is growing on, as well as the operational values and goals of management. So in some cases, we might manage stands that are as small as less than half an acre in size if it seems appropriate, or we might manage larger stands that are 100 hectares in size if we deem it appropriate. When I speak of composition, I'm speaking specifically about the species composition of a stand, and in silviculture, both by historical context and by deliberate intent, when we're talking about composition silviculture, we're typically talking about the woody plant composition of stands, meaning trees and shrubs. That does not mean we wouldn't be considering both other forms of vegetation and the ecosystem as a whole. When we speak of forest stand structure, we're talking about the development of stands. So, for example, if we were to go out and abandon a field in a climate that's conducive to forest ecosystem development, over time, forest plants would colonize that abandoned field, and eventually trees would come to grow on that abandoned field. Those trees would eventually form a closed canopy and then follow a sequence of structural development stages that is very typical of the way forests develop over time. So, although people have very broad and all-encompassing definitions of succession, increasingly forest ecologists and silviculturalists restrict the word succession to refer to specifically the dynamics of species composition changing through time, as opposed to only referring to structures. So, for example, if we were to agree that a sugar maple dominated stand is a late successional forest, therefore a 50-year-old sugar maple stand is still a late successional forest, despite the fact that it is not an old forest. Stand dynamics and silviculture. The purpose of this webinar is to cover a number of terms and concepts related to how stands change and develop through time to serve the climate change silviculture tool that has been developed under this BRACE project. A fundamental understanding of stand dynamics is critical to success in the practice of silviculture. Silviculture is not a science, despite the fact that we hopefully rely on and utilize a scientific method and a lot of science and knowledge to inform silviculture. But in fact, silviculture is a practice of trial and error. Some people even refer to it as an art that relies on the practitioner being able to project future stand condition and predict the results of a silvicultural treatment. So, for example, if I were to remove 30% of the canopy of this stand, what will happen? An alternate example. How do I encourage sugar maple regeneration in this stand? Or how do I encourage white pine regeneration when the understory is already dominated by balsam? So, although in practice, operationally, a lot of forest professionals may pick from a suite of recipes to practice silviculture, or maybe in fact be told what silviculture treatment or approach to take, depending on goals. In order to design silviculture, you need to have a fundamental understanding of stand dynamics, such that with a given forest type, a given forest composition on a given site, you would be able to reasonably project, one, how that stand would develop in the absence of silvicultural treatment, and also how it might respond to a given treatment, such that if you wanted a very specific desirable future stand condition, you could design a treatment and a series of treatments that would hopefully lead you towards that desirable outcome, as opposed to an undesirable outcome. An outline of what I'm going to cover this afternoon. So we are going to be doing a quick review of what silvicultural systems are. And then we'll be looking at the stand dynamics of age structure in stands, stand development stages, disturbance severity, succession, and then we'll close with a bit on climate change as it relates to stand dynamics. So, starting with silviculture itself. Silviculture, and here's one working definition, is the practice of establishing and maintaining forest stands that have value to people. So, a quick little exercise I'd like you to do. I would like you to write down your answer to the following question. What is the difference between a silvicultural treatment and a silvicultural system? I'll give you a couple of minutes to write that down. What is the difference between a silvicultural treatment and a silvicultural system? All right, I'm going to move on. Silvicultural treatments. Silvicultural treatments are also referred to as interventions in the practice of silviculture. A silvicultural treatment is a specific action. In other words, something done to a stand intended to manipulate stand composition, structure, and dynamics. In silviculture, we tend to focus primarily on the manipulation of composition and structure of vegetation. As an example, cutting, cutting vegetation, favoring some trees over others, favoring some vegetation over others. In other examples, we might actually manipulate the site character, otherwise known as site preparation. So we might, if we were going to try to establish a tree plantation in an old abandoned field, we might actually prepare and cultivate the site in order to improve the microsites for planting trees. So silviculture primarily relies on the manipulation of vegetation, but it also includes treatments that are designed to manipulate site character, at least at the microsite level. Excuse me. A silvicultural system is a complete plan for the maintenance of stand composition and structure in the long term into the next generation of trees. Classically, in the English language and in Europe, silvicultural systems are classified or grouped by the age structure that the system attempts to maintain, such that in the English language we have even age systems, two-age silvicultural systems, uneven age systems, and irregular systems, depending on the age structure that the system is intended to maintain. So, for example, in even age systems, okay, it's working. There is a deliberate attempt to maintain stands that are exclusively dominated by a single effective age. So in the examples that I'm putting up on this slide, in the first picture, we have an even age stand with a very uniform canopy, where all those trees have clearly grown together and competed for the same growing space. In the second picture, we have fairly uniform regeneration that is established in the shade underneath the canopy of that stand. In silviculture, we would call that a shelter wood regeneration method, as an example. In the next picture, the overstory is removed. That could be natural, or in the case of deliberate silviculture, that could be an actual final removal cut intended to release that regeneration. And then we have that fully developed, closed canopy, even-aged stand again. So that is a visual example of how even-age silvicultural systems work. Stands are regenerated during a relatively short period of time. They grow while they're immature and compete for growing space, at which point they can be tended if so desired. And then eventually the regeneration is established either before or after the harvest of that stand. Even-age silvicultural systems are designed to create and maintain even-age stands. In two-age silvicultural systems, there's a deliberate attempt to create and maintain two-aged or so-called double cohort stands, such that, like an even-age stand, the canopy is dominated by a single effective age, but at the end of the life cycle of that stand, reserves are retained, producing that two-age structure. So if we look at the first picture, we have a two-aged or double cohort stand where the canopy is dominated by a single effective age, and there are scattered older trees that came from some previous stand condition. Regeneration is established in the shade of that canopy. Again, that would be a classical example of a shelterwood regeneration method. Most of the canopy is removed. This could be natural, but again, if we're practicing silviculture, that would be a deliberate attempt to release that advanced regeneration in a final removal cut. So now we're left with scattered residual trees from the previous stand and a newly regenerating stand dominate them until we eventually end up with the same strand structure where we have a stand dominated by a single effective age with scattered older trees from the previous stand condition. In other words, a true double cohort stand or 2H silviculture system. So 2H silviculture systems are designed to create and maintain two-aged or double cohort stands. Uneven age stands are utterly different than even age and 2H stands, and that they are designed to deliberately create and maintain, continuously maintain stands that are an intimate mix of multiple effective ages. So in this sequence of pictures, we see an intimate mix of multiple effective ages in stands that are created and maintained by continuous minor disturbance events. So unlike even-aged and 2H stands, where at the end of their life cycle, the entire stand is regenerated in a very short period of time and replaced with a new one, in an uneven age stand, the stand is repeatedly disturbed through minor disturbance events, creating gaps, allowing new effective ages or new cohorts, or some people use the word age classes, to enter into the canopy of the stand. So in the first picture, we have a mix of different cohorts. In the second picture, there's some sort of minor disturbance that removes some or one of the cohorts in the stand. In this case, it might be a selection harvest or a selection cut that removes some of the older trees and perhaps tends younger trees in the stand. That stand continues to grow. Those holes that were created by those small regeneration gaps fill in with new regeneration. And the stand continues to grow. The most important concept to understand, there's a number of important concepts to understand with regards to uneven age systems, but from a silvicultural perspective and an ecological one, it's important to understand that uneven age stands are created by regular and continuous minor disturbance events that allow new ages of trees, new cohorts of trees to grow successfully into the canopy, right? So unlike thinning, for example, which is essentially exclusively designed to improve the growth rate of spaced out trees, selection harvests or selection cuts that are associated with uneven age silviculture systems, truly uneven age structure being a mix of multiple effective ages of trees. So uneven age silvicultural systems seek to maintain that uneven aged structure. And then somewhere in the middle between these continuums are what are called irregular silvicultural systems, where, like even-aged and 2H systems, there is a distinct regeneration period. Irregular silvicultural systems have long, prolonged, and drug-out regeneration periods, such that during the regeneration period, they kind of look and feel a lot like an uneven age silvicultural system in the sense that we are sort of continuously trying to both harvest mature trees and gradually regenerate new trees. But unlike an uneven age system, once an irregular stand has been regenerated, there is no attempt at continuous recruitment, no deliberate attempt at continuous recruitment of new ages of trees into the canopy of the stand. So during an irregular system, we drag out this long, protracted regeneration period. There could be lots of reasons why we might do that. From a climate change perspective, we might do that purely to hold on to carbon, mitigate climate change for a longer period of time in wood storage of living trees. But eventually, an irregular stand is successfully regenerated over many decades, and then the stand is left to grow and or tended for it. So in the long term, irregular systems actually have more in common with even-aged and 2H systems during the regeneration period, at least operationally speaking, appear to have a lot in common. So, single cohort stands in silviculture and forestry, we refer to these as even-aged stands, are exclusively dominated.
Hello, Kenneth. I'm just going to
Yes,
interrupt you for a second. The translator
sure.
is not able to hear you, so can you just speak closer to the mic? Thank you.
Yes, yes, I'll try that. Okay, so in review, single cohort stands, otherwise known as even-age stands, are exclusively dominated by a single effective age. And they are the result of single major disturbance events that produce very uniform stands dominated by that single effective age. As opposed to double cohort stands, which as well are dominated by a single effective age, but they have residual trees that survive the disturbance. A classical example for this in our part of the world of the Northeast would be red pine forests that regenerate following fire. Typically, a red pine forest would burn frequently throughout its life cycle, being affected by low severity fires that don't regenerate the entire forest. But every few centuries, there would be a single event, a high severity fire event that would burn most of the trees and most of the canopy, individual red pine surviving. A newly regenerated red pine stand forming that's uniform in its age structure, but with old red pine veteran trees that survive the fire. So double cohort stands, 2H stands, have a canopy that are dominated by a single effective age that originated from a single event, but they have individual trees that survive disturbance. As opposed to multi-cohort stands, otherwise known as uneven age stands, which are an intimate mix of different effective ages of trees, which are the result of repeated minor disturbance events that allow those new trees, new effective ages to grow into the canopy. So I have another exercise for you. I would like you to write down your answer to the following question. And I'm going to again give you about 2 minutes to write down some thoughts, jot down some notes. What happens after a stand is clear cut? Okay, I'm going to move on. The next portion of this presentation I wanted to cover is looking at typical development patterns that occur in stands that are dominated by a single effective age. This slide shows a sequence of progressions through development stages that are typical of all forest stands. The first development being the stand initiation stage that we see on the left-hand side of that slide. Stand initiation stages are triggered by major disturbance events. In other words, stand replacing events, such as a cutover, clear cut, if you will, a very intense windstorm event, a stand replacing fire, an abandoned field. So the stand initiation stage, the frequency of which that stand initiation phase occurs in a stand utterly depends on either A, the natural disturbance regime of a given area and on a given type of ecosite with a given in a given topography, or it may be entirely driven by the form of silviculture that is imposed upon that site. So, for example, intensively managed spruce plantations in the Maritimes are under increasing pressure to have the rotation shortened. So, stand initiation stages in spruce plantations that are where the stand is intended to be pure spruce, for example, the stand initiation phase might occur every 40 to 60 years, whereas a natural stand initiation phase in a sugar maple type stand naturally might be hundreds of years between those kinds of wind events that might blow down the most of the canopy in a sugar maple forest. During the stand initiation phase, there is full sunlight available to the newly developing trees. Depending on the nature of the disturbance agent that initiated that stand initiation phase, you can have a wide mix of forms of tree regeneration present during the stand initiation phase. For example, if the disturbance agent was an intense windstorm or a timber harvest where only the canopy is removed and the regeneration layer survives, you might have a lot of advanced regeneration that established itself under the canopy of the previous stand. You might have trees that are regenerating vegetatively from stump sprouts and or root suckers. You might have trees that regenerate from seed that's blown in. A classical example in our part of the world would be any one of the birch species that, even though there might not very much presence in that stand before the event, they might still blow into the stand. And then we also have species that have the ability to have their seed lay dormant on site in the organic horizon of the soil for decades. A classical example would be pin cherry, for example. Eventually, that tree vegetation forms a closed canopy and enters what's called the stem exclusion stage. Some people refer to this as self-thinning, and I think another term for that I've read is aggradation, but in this terminology we're using, we're describing it as the stem exclusion stage. During the stem exclusion stage, trees compete for growing space, and in climates and or sites where moisture is not limiting during the growing season, the primary thing they're competing for is light. In drier climates, yes.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for a second.
Yes.
I am again seeing that a few people are not able to hear you. So I'm just going to ask people if anyone else is having the same problem.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you can just say if you're having the problem or type it. Okay, so it seems that Ron is not able to hear you clear enough, but I believe it's fine for everyone else. Ron, is this voice okay for you right now? Okay. Sorry, Gareth. You can continue, but please try to speak close to the microphone because Ron is having issues. Sorry.
Sure. Am I good to go? So,
Yes.
returning to where we left off, I think there's two important factors to. I think there's a number of factors to consider when looking at stem exclusion stages. But stem exclusion stages are not only defined by that dominance of that single effective age, trees competing for growing space, and the effect that has on tree form and tree growth rates and canopy structure and composition. But it also effectively suppresses new age groups of regeneration from entering the canopy. So it doesn't necessarily exclude trees from regenerating. So, for example, some of our very shade-tolerant late successional species are perfectly capable of regenerating under very closed canopy stands, but during the stem exclusion stage, they're typically prevented from any form of any meaningful development. So one might have a thicket or a carpet of shade-tolerant regeneration like sugar maple or balsam fir or red spruce regeneration established under the stem exclusion stage, but during the stem exclusion stage, that understory is effectively suppressed from developing and growing into the canopy. Trees, however, do not live forever. Eventually, large dominant trees begin to die due to old age and or disease or whatever else. And unlike the exclusion stage, where tree mortality is primarily driven by competition for growing space, during the next development stage, which is known as understory reinitiation, the death of large dominant trees actually forms canopy gaps that allow regeneration to start growing into the canopy. The process of understory reinitiation can be very short or can take decades to centuries, depending on the composition and the physical characteristics of the tree species, eventually leading to a so-called old growth development stage, where the stand becomes driven by the gradual death of individual and groups of trees due to old age and the disease and pathogens associated with that, leading to a multi-age stand that is driven by that development stage. I use the term so-called old growth because Oliver and Larson, who wrote the classical stand dynamics textbook, chose to use the word old growth development stage to describe that very late stage of development of stands. However, as we probably all know who have worked in the forest sector, people have very differing and highly variable definitions of what the word old growth in fact means. But in the context of this presentation, I'm using Oliver and Larson's classical definition, using the word old growth as a development stage as opposed to referring to the trees themselves being old. So the word old growth being here a very late development stage where following this sequence of events and distinguishing that from a multi-cohort or an uneven age stand, which is driven by repeated frequent disturbance events, right? So an uneven age stand that is being managed through an uneven age system is repeatedly and deliberately disturbed to maintain an uneven age structure. That is not the same thing as what I'm trying to depict in this slide, which is actually the product of a long, long period of time in the absence of a major disturbance event. So what we're talking about at the end of this sequence is a very, very old, multi-aged forest driven by the death of individual trees and groups of trees, as opposed to something that's repeatedly disturbed, which is what a true multi-cohort or uneven age stand is. Speaking of disturbances, we have major disturbance events that affect the development of stands, major disturbance events that essentially regenerate entire stands in a very short period of time, whether that's through cutting, through wind events, through fire, whatever else. Major disturbance events can produce very uniform stand structures. Sometimes individual trees survive, producing this classical 2-age structure that we look at, versus minor disturbance events where only gaps are created in the canopy. Stands that are affected by repeated and continuous minor disturbance events eventually potentially lead to uneven age. Disturbance severity refers to the vegetation that is destroyed and or cut during an event. So in this example, we have a high severity major disturbance, where not only is the majority of the overstory destroyed by the disturbance, but the majority of the regeneration layers. This example is meant to demonstrate how white pine, for example, regenerates naturally from fire. So if we imagine that in the top slide, top picture, we have a spruce fir white pine stand, and either deliberately through silviculture or naturally through fire, the spruce and the fir is destroyed, both in the canopy and the regeneration layer. And then we have white pine regenerating essentially in full sunlight from seed trees. So high severity major disturbances are stand replacing events where the majority of the canopy is destroyed and the majority of the regeneration layer is destroyed. As opposed to moderate severity major disturbances, where only the overstory is destroyed. So in this example, we have a spruce fir stand with a regeneration layer that establishes itself underneath the canopy, and then only the canopy is destroyed by that major disturbance event. In humid climates where fire is naturally infrequent, the frequency of moderate severity events would be much more frequent naturally than high severity events. So for example, in the historical climate of the Maritimes in the Northeast in general, the Maritimes in New England, high severity, it's not that naturally high severity events did not occur, but they were highly infrequent due to the humidity of our climate and the conditions that would come together for that to happen, as opposed to moderate severity major disturbance, which were, I'm not saying naturally happened every 40 years or every 60 years necessarily, but they were certainly more frequent disturbances where regeneration layers survived. And then finally, low severity minor disturbance, again, where unlike a major disturbance event, only minor components of the stand are disturbed, creating canopy gaps that allow new growth and new development into the canopy of the stand, but do not regenerate the entire stand all at once. And again, repeated low severity minor disturbance events lead to true uneven aged or multicolor stands. I think this might be the final exercise I have for you. So if we'd write down the answer to the following questions. 1, what happens after a stand is cut and a well-established regeneration layer survives? And 2, what happens after a stand is cut and no regeneration layer? Okay, I'm going to continue. Next thing I want to focus on is a brief discussion about succession. So succession from a stand dynamics perspective in forest ecology is the change in dominance and compositional dominance of vegetation. And in stand dynamics specific to forest ecology, we're almost always specifically talking about canopy composition of trees, which dominate the vegetation in forest. So on the right, I have an example A, a mix of early and later successional species. And during that sequence, on the left in the second photo, we have a rapidly growing early successional species that initially dominates vegetation. And then eventually that later successional species succeeding it, leading to the dominance of that later successional species. That could be the end of a successional sequence, if that is in fact late species, or in more complex forests, it might actually lead to a mid-successional stage. In the example on the left, the ability for that later successional species to succeed the early successional species entirely depends on its shade tolerance, because for a period of time that you can see in the second image, it is being completely suppressed by that early successional species. This would be something we would see in mixed wood stands, for example, where we have shade tolerant species like spruce and fir. On the right, we have a different example leading to a similar outcome where we have early and later successional species in the top photo. But in this case, the later successional species, because of its lack of shade tolerance, actually must achieve a fairly, at least codominant canopy position in order to succeed that later successional species. Forest ecologists refer to the successional pattern on the left as the tolerance model, meaning the later successional species tolerate. Some people refer to this as the inhibition model. The early successional species are inhibiting the growth of the later successional species. Whereas on the right, we have an example of what's called the parallel model, where that late successional species, in order for it to succeed, must be able to maintain a relatively competitive position in the canopy, otherwise it dies. So, for example, on the right, white pine, for example, is only intermediate in its shade tolerance. So if it were suppressed for long enough in that second photo in sequence A, the white pine would not only not amount to much, but it might actually die due to the shade. So succession is that shift in the dominance, a shift in the compositional dominance of vegetation. And this sort of classical example from classical forestry textbooks, we have an early successional hardwood stand and later successional species eventually appearing in the understory and eventually succeeding the early successional species. That is an example of the classical Clementsian relay floristics pattern, sort of like the idea of a relay race, where a relay switch where one group of species follows the other. What we've found in our forest types is that this successional pattern is actually not very common. Typically, late successional species and early successional species actually start out together at the beginning of a stand development process. And over time, the later successional species eventually outlive and succeed the early successional species. Succession, of course, can be and is frequently interrupted by disturbance events. The example picture I have here on the slide, we again have a spruce fir white pine stand, and then some sort of high severity event has not only killed the canopy but destroyed the regeneration layer. So, for example, certainly in the climate of the Maritimes, including most parts of New England, natural white pine dominated stands are either the result of abandoned fields or the result of fire. I have seen sites in the Great Lakes region in a hotter, drier climate where I've seen white pine forming almost like a late successional community on very dry, rocky sites. And in our part of the world, in the absence of fire, some event that allows white pine to dominate, white pine forests succeed at something else. So in this sequence that we're looking at, if there was no disturbance event, the white pine trees would eventually die, and we would end up with a late successional spruce fir stand. So in closing, I think the other thing to constantly recognize is that some stand development and stand dynamics patterns repeat themselves repeatedly. Some do not. The pathways that they follow depend on not only the site of the character of the site and the specific and current composition of the stand, they also depend on climate. And that's not only at the ecozone level related to historical climate and climate change, but also at the local and ecoregion level. Some example from the past that we can look at. There's some research that I'm aware of that I know that I saw a presentation that Alan White gave it's about 10 years ago, referencing his research into the pollen record, looking at the presence of eastern hemlock versus spruce fir in the Northeast. And his research would suggest that over millennia, as the climate has warmed in the Northeast, that eastern hemlock has spread into the humid ecoregions of the Northeast. And as the climate has cooled, spruce fir types have spread into those areas. So as an example, a specific example was the presence of eastern hemlock in central Maine and central northern Brunswick at the time of European settlement. His research, my understanding of it, suggested that the presence of eastern hemlock stands in that part of the world was actually a legacy of a previous climate. And that part of the reason why those stands did not regenerate in hemlock when they were harvested by European settlers was because the regeneration layer in those stands was dominated by spruce and fir, which was an indicator of the Little Ice Age and a change in climate. There's been similar research in Quebec that has shown that the presence of white pine forests in the boreal climate of Quebec is actually a legacy of a previous warm climate during the time when the Norse were settling Greenland, for example, and an increase in both warmth and fire frequency in the boreal forest that allowed white pine to establish itself in the southern boreal forest in Quebec. Research into red spruce, as a final and third example, suggests that over millennia, red spruce, being uniquely dependent upon cool, humid to per-humid climates, when the climate warms, tends to both come down the mountains, or when the climate cools, the pollen record shows that red spruce has spread both inland from the cool, humid ecoregions in the Maritimes and come down the mountains in the Appalachians. And then when the climate has warmed, that red spruce has retreated to high elevation, cool, humid sites and to those cool, humid to pure humid ecoregions in the Maritimes. And some of the research in Quebec and Ontario suggests that the populations of red spruce in Western, in Quebec and Ontario are actually a legacy of a previous colder and more humid climate. Thank you very much for listening to me for the better part of an hour.
That's great, Gareth. Thank you. No one has typed any questions just yet. A couple of people are saying thanks, though. Sarabi, can you unmute the participants just in case anyone does have any questions they'd like to ask? Perfect, thank you. So if anyone does have any questions that they'd like to put to Gareth, now's your time. We do have a few people typing as well.
Thank you, Mike. I've never done this before. This was really agonizing for me.
It's hard when you can't see the people. Gareth, Megan has a question. How can you read a stand or properly, okay, how can you read a standard property and determine if it's a regular, irregular system versus an uneven aged or multi-cohort system?
Okay. Well, there's been you know, there's been a lot of research.
Sorry, Gareth, you're cutting out.
Oh, sorry. If we were to get in our time machine and travel back in time to a pre-settlement forest, you know, I think the thing is that what we do know is that on a wide range of zonal sites, major disturbance events were relatively infrequent in the pre-European settlement forest in the Northeast, such that stands did enter those very old multi-age development stages for extended periods of time. How long that development stage lasted was probably highly variable. You know, in some cases, it might last a century or more. In some cases, maybe 100 years. But if we think about, for example, the predominant major disturbance event that would have affected our pre-settlement forest would have been wind, and a wind event blowing down a very old forest, it's multi-aged, you would end up with a very irregular stand developing following that, because the understory of those stands would have been highly irregular, mixed with trees of different heights and different ages and different densities. So that would be an example of a natural irregular stand. Truly uneven age stands, you should be able to distinctly identify multiple ages in the stand, such that it would be impossible to identify a dominant age in the stand. And typically truly uneven age stands not only have very distinct different ages in the canopy of the forest, they would have distinctly different and continuous regeneration layers in them as well, especially in our forest. Uneven age stands that are the product of frequent low severity fire that occurs in dry forest types are an entirely different thing.
We still have a couple of minutes left if anybody has any questions. Megan did say thanks. I don't see anyone typing, but if you do have any questions about the presentation today, you can feel free to pass them on to me, and I will pass those on to Gareth and see if we can find you an answer. I want to thank Gareth very much for presenting today, and I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. We hope you'll join us again for future webinars and other project events that are coming. And I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you.